In the dim candlelight of a draughty great hall somewhere in 14th century England, a table groaned beneath its own ambitions. Platters of roasted meats, trencher breads soaked with gravy, and pies that had absolutely nothing to do with fruit sprawled across a linen cloth that was, at best, beige with purpose. A noble feast, one meant to impress, not just feed. Carefully arranged according to a dizzying maze of rules more complicated than your modern office fridge policy. Because, oh yes, there were rules. So many rules. Not just about what one could eat, but when, where, with whom, and in what order. And while the medievals might have lacked electricity and decent dentistry, they were absolute champions of overthinking dinner. Let's start with the who eats what. Social hierarchy determined everything, from your seat at the table to how many courses you received. The lord and lady sat at the high table, elevated both literally and metaphorically, while peasants and servants lingered below, absorbing crumbs and absolutely none of the roast swan. Food flowed downhill only in the metaphorical sense. Social mobility was not on the menu. Yet here's the thing. Many of their eating habits, born of superstition, etiquette, and the lingering fear of God watching during supper, somehow wiggled their way into our daily routines. Like the most obedient of leftovers, they've stuck around. Take, for example, the practice of hand washing before meals. It wasn't just about hygiene, which, to be clear, was an alien concept. People back then bathed in rumours more than water. No, washing your hands before eating had a deeply moral edge. Clean hands equaled a pure soul. Dirty fingers, a feast for the devil. Cleanliness was quite literally next to godliness. So next time you stand at the sink scrubbing off pizza grease, just know you are participating in a sacred rite that once involved a pitcher, a basin, and a servant who had to guess when, exactly, you needed rinsing. Excuse me, my lord, your holiness is crusty once again. Even the way courses were served had rules that echo faintly in today's dinner parties. Meals opened with lighter fare, frumenti, a wheat porridge so dull not even birds wanted it, and warm ale. It was intended to open the stomach, much like modern appetizers tease your digestive tract with suggestive little nibbles. Then came the removere, the physical removal of dishes and the literal removal of sins, supposedly. You could practically hear the feasting hierarchy sigh in pious relief. These courses would then crescendo into meat-laden spectacles, boars' heads stuffed with herbs, pies with entire birds baked inside, feathers reattached just for flair, before drifting down into sugary dreams of comfits and spiced wine. Like a medieval tasting menu, but with more fur and questionable poultry decisions. Now, here's a sleepy little secret. This idea of structuring a meal, lighter dishes to start, heavier in the middle, sweet at the end, lingers in modern dining manners. The ghost of a nobleman's feast still hovers over our dinner plates. You might scoff at medieval folks sipping broth before roast goose, but then chug a green smoothie before tackling your lunchtime burrito bowl and call it balance. And let's not forget table manners, still haunting us centuries later. In the Middle Ages, licking your fingers after eating was loudly discouraged, but curiously, wiping them on your tunic was just sort of tolerated. Napkins weren't yet a standard fixture. Your clothes were the napkin. Fashion, therefore, doubled as record-keeping. Ah, I see Sir Geoffrey has had stew again. 3 days running, if that stains to be trusted. But don't get too smug about your lemon-scented hand wipes and cloth napkins. Even something as simple as not reaching across the table started here. In medieval times, lunging for extra gravy could earn you a mild glare, or, in more spirited households, a gentle whack with a spoon. The rule was, only take what's closest to you and wait your turn. Sound familiar? It's basically lunchroom etiquette 101, courtesy of the House of Plantagenet. Even the absence of forks is worth dozing off over. They were considered scandalously dainty when first introduced. Real people, people with character, used knives and fingers. Forks were seen as decadent, an affront to God's own utensils, your hands. Using a fork was like drinking tea with your pinky out while riding a golden goat, absurd and vaguely sinful. Nevertheless, the fork survived its controversial beginnings and now lives happily ever after, mainly stuck in drawers tangled with measuring spoons. As you drift deeper into the sleepy nostalgia of dinners long eaten and tablecloths long stained, consider this. The rituals surrounding food, oddly precise and often bewildering, weren't just about survival. They were about solace, structure, and the strange comfort of knowing when and how to pass the salt, which, by the way, sat in a communal bowl called the salt cellar at the center of the table, a weird little medieval landmark. If you were seated above the salt, you mattered. If you sat below it, better develop a good personality. So the next time you unwrap a napkin, offer the last fry to your friend, or assert the sacred order of appetizer main dessert, remember, you're following rules established by candlelight, enforced by lords, and fueled by roast pheasant dreams. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now snuggle in deeply. Tomorrow, a strange little rule about fish, and Fridays waits patiently, just behind the pantry door. It begins, as so many tales of medieval dining do, with bread. Not the crusty wood-fired sourdoughs that haunt your favorite bakery's Instagram feed. No, this bread was a different beast entirely. The medieval trencher, a loaf so sturdy, so stoically indifferent to softness, it was used as furniture. Imagine this. You've been invited to a feast somewhere in England around the 13th century. You've wrestled into your one good tunic, borrowed sandals from your cousin, the one without noticeable foot odor, and you're now approaching a long wooden table inside a stone hall lit entirely by fire and ambition. You sit down, and there, waiting for you, is not a plate. It is bread, a large flat hunk, cut with all the finesse of someone using a butter knife to carve marble. This is your trencher, and it will serve as your plate, napkin, and, if you play your crumbs right, dessert. Trenchers weren't meant to be eaten immediately. They were dense, coarse, and often several days old, like the edible version of a gloomy Tuesday. Their job was not to excite your palate, but rather to stoically soak up meat juices, sauces, and the occasional dignity of a fallen pea. When the meal was over, the trenchers were sometimes handed out to the poor, because nothing says charity quite like offering people your leftover plate toast soaked in mutton grease. Now, while we no longer eat off week-old loaves for dinner today, at least not intentionally, this whole ceremony of the edible plate left behind an echo. The open-faced sandwich. You see, the trencher was the ancestor of a modern culinary genre we rarely pause to consider. Before we ever thought to put 2 slices of bread around a morsel of roast beef, we were piling the entire meal atop a singular slab of bread, sauce and all. Every time you fork tuna and cheese onto a slice of sourdough and call it lunch, you're whispering an unintentional thank you to some nameless medieval cook who once looked at a hard flat loaf and thought, "Yes, this is flat enough to put the goose drippings on." Another ghost from medieval meals lingers in how we arrange seating. It was tremendously important in those grand feasts who sat where. The most honoured guests sat at the high table, literally raised, as if placed on a regal shelf. Those of middling status were arranged along the sides, while the expendable masses, apprentices, peasants, and anyone perpetually sneezing, pulled up benches wherever they could, likely next to something suspiciously moving. And thus, we find the ancestor of the kids' table at Thanksgiving, or that strange sense of achievement you feel when you're told your restaurant booth has priority seating. It all harks back to a time when your social rank dictated how close you got to the roast swan and how far you sat from the dripping wall torches. Social stratification by seating arrangement, now available with velvet ropes, cover charges, and online reservations. But let us return to the food itself, which, like a shy cousin at a family reunion, tended to arrive in courses. Only back then, courses were less about logical segmentation and more about shocking quantity. A light starter might involve 5 roasted pigeons, 6 trenchers, a jug of wine, and an argument about who stole the peppercorns. Speaking of pepper, pause for dramatic seasoning. This humble spice was once so valuable it could be used to pay rent, like a barter system devised by particularly brave squirrels. To serve heavily peppered meat was not only a culinary decision, but a social one. It was flashing your wealth in the form of spicy entitlements. Flavortown, in the 13th century, came with serious real estate accounts, and therein lies the accidental inheritance. While today we rarely pay rent in black pepper, though landlords take note, the idea of prestigious ingredients persists like a persistent thyme sprig on a Michelin-starred entree. Truffle oil, saffron threads, pink Himalayan salt hauled up from a lab coat-wearing Sherpa's basement, all descendants of the pepper principle, food as status. In the end, the medieval table was not just a place for nourishment. It was theatre, economics, and very bad dental hygiene all rolled into one. And while the rules were strict, don't wipe your knife on the tablecloth, don't stare at the salt, don't pick your teeth with your dagger, they continue to echo in the background of every catered event and awkward wedding buffet. Now then, as the torches dim and the smell of roasted something lingers in our sleepy medieval hall, we may close our eyes and drift toward the next curious morsel of food history, a curious, chewy idea we may have swallowed without question. For centuries, there is a quiet sort of majesty to the medieval table, even if it was occasionally sticky and almost always smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. It was not just a place for food, it was a battlefield of cutlery decisions, social posturing, and unspoken culinary commandments. And, what's most delicious of all, many of these rules still hover, ghost-like, over our modern meals. Let's revisit the medieval notion of the bread trench, a culinary innovation and a truly biodegradable dinner plate. Picture it, a thick, stale hunk of bread placed humbly on the table, waiting, not to be eaten, but to catch any stew your spoon failed to keep under control. In an age suspicious of anything too clean, wooden trenchers rotted, and silver was far too noble for soup. But bread absorbed both sauce and sin. Today, we may have swapped them for ceramic dishes and paper towels, but the same principle survives in our fondness for bread bowls, edible taco shells, and dessert served in chocolate cups. All iterations of mankind's noble desire to consume the vessel, and thus avoid doing dishes. A medieval dishwasher's dream. Then we have manners. Ah yes, The medieval dinner party was a minefield of politeness traps, albeit slower moving than the ones you'd find in Renaissance Italy. A strict code governed who sat where, what you could touch, and most importantly, how you handled salt. You see, salt wasn't merely a seasoning. Salt was status congealed into crystal. At a grand feast, a large, ornately crafted salt cellar, often the size of a small yacht, sat in the middle of the table. Guests deemed important were seated above the salt, closer to the lord or lady of the manor. Everyone else, well, they sat below the salt, where the potatoes were probably more potato than truffle. Fast forward a few centuries, and while we no longer divide guests by their proximity to the household salt shaker, the echoes remain. We still obsess over seating charts at weddings. We still place Aunt Margaret next to the salmon, but politely out of earshot from the bride. In every awkward family meal, there is a faint whisper of a medieval herald struggling with parchment, pen, and passive-aggressive scrolls. And let us not overlook the mighty spoon, which often overshadowed the knife and fork in medieval mealtimes. Most people didn't own personal cutlery. In fact, guests brought their own spoons, sort of the original BYO thing. If you forgot yours, well, get cozy with your fingers, or hope your host had extras, preferably ones not previously used to stir anything involving eels. The reverence for cutlery persists. We still raise eyebrows at the odd person who slices spaghetti with a spoon, or tries to use a fork when it's very clearly a finger food situation. Medievals had fewer utensils, but somehow more rules. Do not reach across the table. Do not lick your knife. And do not, under penalty of exile to the children's table, double dip your trencher. Layered beneath these rules was a near theological attitude toward temperature. Medieval folks were obsessed with it, not just inside their soup, but inside their souls. Inspired by ancient Greek medicine, people believed in balancing humors, not the funny, kind, but the bodily fluids that governed your emotional and physical health. Eating too much cold food, like lettuce, might make you melancholic. Overdosing on hot food, like onions or red wine, risked outbursts of choleric anger. A cucumber could ruin your whole temperament if consumed on the wrong moon phase. This is the ancestral womb of our modern food fads. Gran likes to tell you vinegar cures everything. Well, medieval physicians thought vinegar could literally adjust your blood. Today's kale cleanses are but whispers of yesteryear's roasted fennel therapies. We are all, in a way, balancing saber with superstition. And of course, the feast. The most legendary medieval meals weren't really about food. Not entirely. They were about theatre. A peacock in full plume, roasted and redressed in its own feathers, was just as much an Instagram moment as any latte art today. Subtlety, as they called it. An edible sculpture announcing you've either made it or deeply misunderstood your household budget. So the next time you gaze over a charcuterie board, arranged with surgical precision and drizzled with just enough balsamic glaze to suggest prosperity but not pretension, know that you are partaking in a lineage far older and far breadier than you imagine. And beyond the table, behind the curtain of clinking goblets, another medieval food commandment waited patiently to be obeyed. One that had nothing to do with manners or temperature, and everything to do with when one should eat, and when absolutely one mustn't. At the grand and crumb-encrusted table of the medieval feast, one rule rose above all others, an unspoken commandment passed from noble to knight, to the wide-eyed apprentice summoned to pour the wine without dropping the jug into the mutton. That rule, thou shalt not eat with both hands. Now, this was not because our medieval ancestors were especially tidy. No, cleanliness was more ambition than reality. The rule had more to do with appearances, hierarchy, and making sure no one got ideas above their station, especially while chewing. Picture this. The year is 1372. You're wearing a tunic that barely fits. You haven't bathed since St. Walburga's Day, and you've finally been invited to dine with your local lord. The roast boar glistens. The trenchers, those dense, stale, plate-shaped hunks of bread, are stacked high. But before you dive in, better keep one hand conspicuously clean, covered in a napkin, folded solemnly into your lap like it's attending a funeral. Medieval etiquette books, which existed mostly for nobles and those aspiring not to be elbowed out of society, insisted upon the sacred use of the right hand for eating. The left, reserved for decidedly non-feasting duties, the kind involving communal privies and the absence of plumbing. As such, using both hands was practically culinary blasphemy, so you'd rip that bread with one hand. You'd delicately pick at your lamprey pie, yes, lamprey, the medieval take on comfort food that resembles a sea-mouthed eel with ambition. And if you needed to cut anything, that's what knives were for. And who brought their own knife to dinner? Everybody. Your knife was your passport to the table, assuming you didn't use it for anything too stabby beforehand. Now here's the curious bit. That one-hand-only dining habit echoes ever so faintly into the modern world. Ever wonder why so many of us instinctively keep one hand in our lap at formal dinners? Or why we clutch our napkins with the elegance of someone guarding state secrets? Ancient etiquette still lives, disguised as modern manners. And napkins, oh napkins. These were not the crisp, triangle-folded linen soldiers we know today. Napkins in the 1300s were less cloth and more aspiration. Guests often used the tablecloth, which was surprisingly acceptable, or a communal wiping cloth shared along the table, a kind of social sponge, which lends new meaning to the phrase sharing a meal. It's in these little behaviors, one-hand eating, the suspicious side-eye toward double dippers, that we discover medieval food rules have quietly stowed away into our daily rituals. The next time you're at a formal dinner and you see someone tear their bread in careful halves, placing one politely to the side, know this: they are echoing the ghosts of feasts past. And should someone reach across your plate with both hands to get the butter, you are fully within the rights of ancient etiquette to look at them with the subtle disapproval of a 14th century priory nun. No words, just the gaze of centuries weighing upon them. Dining in medieval times wasn't just about eating. It was a performance. Every bite, every gesture, rehearsed over generations to prove you knew your place and could be trusted not to gnaw the roast goose straight off the bone. In public, to eat properly was to behave properly. It was a chance to elevate yourself, or at the very least, not smear gravy across your neighbour's kirtle. And so we, unknowingly, maintain the choreography. One hand on the fork, one hand discreetly navigating the mysteries of the napkin. Perhaps a quiet sip of wine with exaggerated grace, mimicking the courtly elegance of someone who once dined beside a tapestry and half feared being poisoned by the salad. As the candlelight of history flickers low, we drift softly into the next course, not just of the meal, but of time itself. The table is being cleared, the trenchers discarded, or fed to the poor if the host felt generous or guilty. But the rules, like the lingering scent of rosemary and roasted fowl, remain. There's more to taste, more oddities to savor, just over the curve of this dreamy horizon. And then there was the matter of fingers. Ah, yes. The medieval dining table's most underappreciated utensil was already attached to your hands. Today, we raise our sanitized eyebrows at greasy, fingers in polite company, reaching for moist towelettes or whispering apologies if we lick gravy from our own knuckles. But for our medieval forebears, the notion of spotless dining might have earned you a suspicious glance, as if you were one of those people who read books for fun, instead of because the bishop told you to. For much of the Middle Ages, forks were nowhere to be seen. In Western Europe, they were considered both unnecessary and, depending on whom you asked, slightly evil. Some said it was vanity. Others said it was just Eastern affectation. The Byzantines had them, sure, but then the Byzantines had all sorts of things, like functional plumbing and a city that didn't catch fire every Tuesday. Medieval folks used knives for cutting and fingers for everything else. And when they dined together, and remember, meals at the time could involve benches groaning under the weight of nobles, knights, monks, and possibly a lute player who wasn't invited but just kind of wandered in. There were rules. Specific rules. Bodily rules. First, hands must be washed before meals. That sounds quite modern and hygienic, until you realize their hand-washing station often involved a communal bowl of tepid, reused water and a rather damp linen towel that had pondered the idea of dryness but ultimately rejected it. Still, the gesture mattered. Washing hands before meals became a ritual of courtesy and status. If you were a noble, someone might even pour water over your fingers from an ornate ewer, as if you were a medieval raccoon being prepped for fine dining. Now, a charmingly awkward tradition. Two people often shared a trencher, a thick slab of yesterday's bread used as a plate. Not only did you sit next to your dinner partner, you also shared the same carb-based dishware. If one of you had a cold, well, too bad. You'd be sharing that too. Etiquette at the table wasn't about opulence so much as it was about obedience and order, and keeping one's fingers, quite literally, in check. You were not to reach across other people's trenchers. You were not to lick your fingers before dipping them back in the communal sauce bowl. That rule somehow still holds up, and woe betide the person who used their left hand at the table. In many parts of medieval Europe, the left hand was the unclean hand, reserved for, let's say, backstage bodily functions. To eat with it would have been like bringing a used handkerchief to a potluck. These finger-related faux pas were more than minor decorum breaches. They reflected a worldview where the table mirrored society. If your fingers wandered where they shouldn't, it wasn't merely rude. It was a rebellion of sorts, like wearing your hat at the wrong tilt, or forgetting to call the abbot your worshipful pancakery, or whatever ludicrous title he insisted upon that week. In this finger-forward world, the act of eating was performative. You weren't just consuming meat pie. You were demonstrating your virtue, your breeding, and your willingness not to drool on the salt cellar. And don't think the salt cellar was ordinary either. It was often a Lord of the Rings level artifact carved from crystal, ivory, or unicorn rumors. Its placement on the table physically separated the nobility above the salt from the lower ranking guests below the salt. So yes, salt placement divided people long before Twitter ever did. But still, fingers reign supreme. A graceful, grease-slicked pinky could be the difference between being admired or being given the guest seat with the mildew problem. The resistance to forks, by the way, persisted for centuries. Even when they crept in from Italy, they were met with suspicion. Some clergymen declared that using a fork was an offense to God's divine cutlery, your fingers, gifted from heaven and pre-attached. It wasn't until the 17th century that forks could comfortably take their place at court without being accused of witchcraft or Byzantine sympathies. And even then, it took some time before people started using them correctly, as opposed to, say, picking their teeth with them. So next time you see someone at a modern dinner party struggle to determine which fork is for the salad, just know they're participating unwittingly in a 1,000-year tug-of-war over fingers, etiquette, and societal judgment. But that's a tale to chew on gently, like a medieval lord nibbling swan pâté with his index and thumb. And while our imaginations sink further into candlelit halls and crusty trenches, there's something else simmering just beneath the surface. Something about a loaf of bread and a royal betrayal. But let's stretch our legs under the table for a moment and breathe in the warm, garlicky air of curiosity before we venture further into the pantry of history. At the center of a medieval feast, alongside the roaring hearth and the dripping boar roast, was an invisible guest far more important than any noble knight or traveling bard: etiquette. Yes, before Instagrammable dinners, before color-coded cutlery placements, people in the Middle Ages were already deeply devoted to the sacred art of not being gross at the table. In fact, they'd probably faint if they saw how you just wiped your hands on your sweatpants during dinner. No judgment, though. Perhaps a slight medieval tut-tut. Back then, how you ate was quite literally a reflection of your place in the great cosmic order. Manners weren't just about impressing your future in-laws. They were about maintaining civility in a world prone to plagues, livestock in the kitchen, and more than a few heads on spikes. One of the most persistent medieval table rules that still lingers today, often enforced silently by grandmothers and first dates, is this: don't put your elbows on the table. Now, you might think this rule was born from the simple need for more space on crowded banqueting tables, or perhaps to prevent one's linen tunic from soaking up the gravy. No. The truth is oddly poetic and entirely snobbish. Keeping your elbows off the table was a sign of moral discipline. You were expected to keep a straight posture, hands visible, movements graceful, to avoid the horrifying image of slouching over your bowl like a brigand who'd been raised by wolves. Remember, even the peasants had some standards. And nothing says uncivilized quite like resting one's joints in the mashed parsnips. But let's talk about those tables, shall we? Tables weren't tables as we know them. More like wooden planks balanced on trestles. And benches, always benches. Back support was for those cheeky few who happened to be monarchs, bishops, or the elderly with excellent reputations. Everyone else sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping ale from clay jugs and delicately spearing bites of meat with, brace yourself, one single shared knife per pair. That's right. There were no full cutlery sets, no tiny forks for shrimp cocktails, no separate butter knives. If you were lucky enough to own your own eating knife, you brought it with you in a kind of medieval BYOK, bring your own knife. So if your dining partner had the grace of a barnyard goose, you might have to endure both the indignity of sharing a knife and dodging bits of half-chewed venison flying your way. That's why some unwritten rules flourished like well-watered cabbages, like this gem from the 14th century. Do not pick your teeth with your eating knife. It had to be said. Poisonous habits, really. Because nothing says bon appetit like watching someone excavate their molars with the same blade they just used to slice their pie. And speaking of pie, yes, another medieval expectation we still follow, albeit more subtly, is to wait before diving into dessert. You see, in noble households, sweet dishes were often served last, not because anyone thought it was healthier, but because sugar was exorbitantly expensive, like the medieval equivalent of truffle-infused unicorn foam. You didn't lead with the honey tarts. You earned them by enduring 3 courses of suspicious stews, roasted whatever was on hand, and suspiciously textured pottages whose ingredients were largely speculative. But here's the quiet genius of it. This pacing of the meal, start with heavier, savoury dishes, end on a lighter, sweeter note, wasn't just about wealth. It was believed to be more harmonious for the humours. Yes, the bodily balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Popular medical theory held that certain foods triggered certain humours, and dessert, in just the right amounts, could soothe the soul and keep your biles in blissful balance. So in some oddly medieval way, our modern sense of saving room for dessert may have started not in the heart, but in the gallbladder. Now, let's not forget the hierarchy of dining. Ever wonder why we say above the salt? In lavish feasts, a giant salt cellar, that is, a container for salt, not a place to keep your sodium, was placed near the head of the table. Those of higher status sat nearer to it, the rest, farther down the line, trying not to appear too envious. To this day, we say someone lives above the salt to mean they're of higher social standing, even if all they did was get promoted at the office and now have a reserved parking spot. Yes, somewhere between the elaborate codes of chew with your mouth closed and the anxiety of tiny napkins, the ghost of medieval manners continues to hover at our dinners. Each time we pass the bread to the left or wait to be seated, we quietly bow to a time when rules at the table weren't just suggestions. They were serious business, sometimes punishable by glares or actual punishment. But more about that, and the mysterious tale of dinner horns and ceremonial hand-washing. When the fire burns a little lower and the shadows grow a little softer. Imagine you're at a medieval banquet, a great hall flickering with candlelight, the scent of roast meats wafting through the air, and a minstrel in the corner attempting to charm everyone with a lute that's slightly out of tune. Before you lift a goblet or knife, though, beware. There are rules. Many, many rules. One cannot simply wander into a 15th century feast and behave like a modern-day buffet enthusiast. No, in the medieval dining world, your manners could determine if you gained favour with your lord or ate outside with the pigs, and not metaphorically. One of the first things you'd need to remember: don't touch the food with both hands. Using both hands at the same time while eating was akin to licking the Mona Lisa today. It simply implied you had neither breeding nor boundaries. A single hand was expected to suffice, while the other rested neatly, preferably clean, in your lap or on the table. But never outstretched like you were reaching for your 15th pig in a blanket. This one-handed dining etiquette might seem quaint, but it's curiously similar to something many of us instinctively do today. Keeping one hand free while eating. Perhaps we use it to hold a napkin, or our phone to look up whether macaroni is in fact made in Italy. Either way, the ghost of medieval table manners may be helping us remain ever so slightly less sloppy. And speaking of cleanliness, a medieval diner had better come to the table washed. Not just rinsed your hands while humming Happy Birthday, but scrubbed, likely inspected, and ideally perfumed with something slightly more medieval than cucumber melon body spray. Guests at great feasts were expected to wash before and after eating, with the ritual often overseen by servants carrying basins and towels, sometimes adorned in seasonal embroidery that whispered, "Yes, I'm paid to watch you rinse." If that little ritual sounds vaguely familiar, it's because we haven't strayed far. Today, We may not have a towel-bearing servant named Bartholomew standing by, but the ingrained impulse to freshen up before meals continues, especially if Aunt Susan is coming. You know how she feels about sticky fingers on the bread basket. Oh, and speaking of bread, here's a fun, crusty detail. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just a food item. It was a plate. A stale, sometimes weeks-old slab, known as a trencher, served as the base for whatever stew or meat one was allotted. After the meal, the trencher, now soggy with grease, gravy, and regret, might be tossed to dogs or the poor, or occasionally back into the kitchen to see if it could survive another shift. You could call it a multi-use culinary device, or early composting. Fast forward to today and you'll notice that kids still sometimes use bread like a utensil, sopping, scooping, and slathering sauces in a way that would make a medieval diner nod approvingly before whispering, "You'd better wash that paw again." Let's not forget seating etiquette. Medieval feasts were not egalitarian affairs. Where you sat and who you were permitted to sit near was a deeply symbolic affair dictated by a social hierarchy more complex than a modern coffee shop's Wi-Fi password. The lord of the manor sat at the high table, quite literally on a raised dais, flanked by noble guests deemed worthy. Farther down the table, lesser folk muddled through tougher cuts and less frequent hand-washing. Sound familiar? Think office holiday dinners where the CEO sits beneath the chandelier and you, a humble intern who's been with the company for 9 days, find yourself eating close to the kitchen door. The parallels are subtle but undeniably present, and just try helping yourself to something on the table without it being passed to you. In kingly courts, such boldness would have been labelled scandalous. Medieval etiquette demanded that food be offered, not snatched. Reaching across the board was not just unsightly, it was an act that might have cost you more than your dignity. Finger-cracking knuckle wraps weren't invented yesterday. To this day, it's considered bad form to reach across someone's plate like a famished T-Rex. Instead, we continue the delicate dance of, "Would you mind passing the potatoes?" A ritual as old as medieval stew, and slightly less hazardous to one's social standing. So next time you find yourself instinctively washing your hands before dinner, keeping a napkin on your lap, or waiting politely for the butter to make its ceremonial orbit across the table, know this: somewhere deep in the time-addled annals of banquet history, your behavior has already been judged and approved by a monk with a ladle and a very particular set of table rules. And with that final crumb brushed from our doublet, let us gently drift further into this stew of sleepy customs. One bite-sized mystery at a time. Bread, that quiet cornerstone of every kitchen, is perhaps the least suspicious food on the plate, which is exactly how it managed to slip its dusty, yeasty claws around the entire arc of civilization, and particularly the medieval table. In the days of lords with pointy shoes and peasants with ambitions no higher than surviving Thursday, bread was not just food. It was the plate, and sometimes the spoon, and sometimes, confusingly, the napkin. The medieval mind loved a practical object, particularly one that could be gallantly thrown to a dog at the end of a meal. Enter the trencher, a dry, tough slab of yesterday's bread, handily repurposed as edible crockery. You'd eat the stew off of it, then either munch the soggy result or give it to someone less picky, which in a feudal society meant literally everyone ranked lower than you, which was quite a lot of people. But even beyond the trencher, bread enjoyed a moral importance in medieval diets. It wasn't just about being fed. It was about being fed correctly. Bread, you see, reflected your place in society. There was white bread for the rich, fine, fluffy, sifted practically into silk. And then there was dark, coarse rye for the not-so-rich, studded with mystery grains, and, if you were unlucky, the seasonal accompaniment of ergot fungus, which casually induced hallucinations, seizures, and occasionally spontaneous religious revivals. Now, here's a delightful paradox. Although bread was everywhere, the church was deeply invested in how you regarded it, because Jesus was, inconveniently for bakers, very into metaphors, and had once compared himself to a loaf. I am the bread of life. So medieval theology quickly decided that wasting bread was like disrespecting the Son of God himself, which made breadcrumbs something close to sacred debris. People would whisper apologies if they accidentally dropped crumbs, and there were actual laws against trampling them underfoot. Flash forward to your modern kitchen, perhaps with those neat rows of sliced sandwich loaves, and you might notice old echoes of those rules. You still don't waste bread, do you? You feel vaguely sinful throwing out the heel. The freezer is full of future breadcrumbs you'll never quite make. And when the bread turns fuzzy and green, you approach it with the guilt of someone disposing of a tired hope. In a way, the medieval reverence for bread survives in our leftovers. The idea that bread, of all things, carries some sort of gravitas. Not dessert, not apples, bread. Even today, no one thinks twice about tossing half a donut, but a loaf? That requires a moment of gentle mourning. And then there's the slicing. Oh, the slicing. Back then, only important people had their bread personally sliced for them. It was a token of status, a culinary curtsy, the charity of a well-cut wedge. Today, we simply call it supermarket convenience, but deep in the wrapper of pre-sliced bread is the murmuring ghost of medieval hierarchy. Somewhere in that even row of slices is a faint whisper. You are important. Someone sliced this bread for you. As for etiquette, medieval bread rules were tight enough to bewilder a butler. You couldn't bite into it whole. Tearing was more pious, but not too much tearing, or you risked seeming unruly. You couldn't hold it in your left hand, the sinister hand polluted now forever by its unfortunate Latin origins. And if you dared to butter both sides, well, may the saints find you a good corner of purgatory. Even now, food snobbery often begins with bread. Artisan, sourdough starter, baguette with a good chew. You're not just eating something, you're partaking in centuries of fermented status. We have apps that rate bakeries. We film loaves tearing. Somewhere, a medieval monk is turning in his humble grave, muttering that you shouldn't toast the consecrated body of Christ. But speaking of toasting, that too has roots that crinkle with age. In many banquets of the past, slices of bread were floated in wine or ale to soak up less than palatable flavors, or, in darker whispers, poisons. Raising a glass to your health was not merely polite, it was defensive drinking. Today's toasts retain that echo. A gathering of friends, a clink of glasses, and an unspoken hope that nobody's trying to kill you. It's all very medieval, just with more charcuterie boards. And so concludes our quiet contemplation of the loaf that launched 1,000 meals and a few illnesses. Don't worry, we'll wander even deeper into forgotten kitchen commandments next. For where there's bread, meat is never far behind. And oh, do they have opinions about that? By candlelight and cradle snoring quiet, we step into a chapter of culinary customs so potent, so seemingly trivial, that it still lingers in the corners of our modern kitchens today, like that one jar of pickles no one remembers buying, yet somehow survives every fridge purge. Tonight, let's settle into the strange, stoic, and surprisingly long-lived world of mealtime manners. Not the merely Victorian variety with their lace napkin anxieties and post-industrial anxieties, but something older, heavier, greasier, medieval table etiquette. Now, contrary to popular belief, medieval folks weren't chomping on turkey legs with the carefree abandon of a Renaissance fair reenactor. No, there was a system, a hierarchy of hunger and a choreography of chewing. Honor and etiquette were as present at the table as trenchers and turnips. Let's take the idea of the fani, head of the table. Today, your dad might claim it at Thanksgiving, or maybe your cat does, depending on household dynamics. But in the Middle Ages, this was a position of power so symbolically rich, it rivaled a bishop's mitre or a particularly successful beard. At a medieval feast, seating was sacred. Lords at the high end, commoners trickled downward. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was also gravity. Food got served at the top, and by the time it reached the low end, well, let's just say the peasants became very familiar with cabbage and suspicion. Tables were long and bordered with strict unspoken rules. You didn't reach across someone else's plate, not for fear of rudeness exactly, but because arms could be liberally removed in certain courts for crimes against decorum. Now, fork enthusiasts may want to sit down, preferably at the proper end of the table, for this next bit. The fork, that scandalous strumpet of tableware, was once viewed with deep suspicion. It debuted in Byzantium like a shimmering pop star of cutlery, but Western Europe clutched its pearls. Why stab food with a tiny trident, they muttered, when God gave you hands and questionable hygiene? So hands it was, but, and here's the rule still lurking in your grandmother's soul, you had to eat with just 3 fingers. Anything more was considered uncouth, possibly heretical. 3 fingers were aligned with spiritual symbolism, the Trinity, holiness, and also the maximum number of digits you could lick without looking deeply unsettling. The idea that clean hands were essential at the table, that was real too. Before meals, servants would bring around basins of scented water, often infused with herbs or rose petals, a soft cloth, a little bow, a nice ritual that said, "Please wash the mutton off your mitts before grasping the communal loaf." And yes, the communal loaf. Picture a large crusty slab of old bread, known affectionately as a trencher. It wasn't a plate. It wasn't bread for eating, not right away. It was the plate. You'd put your meat, and possibly your moral compass, on it, soaking up the juices like an edible sponge of gravy history. Once the meal concluded, the sodden trencher might be eaten by the lower servants or donated to the poor. Noble intentions, hiding beneath a layer of well-seasoned lamb fat. Now, allow me to gently redirect your sleepy thoughts to the rule of silence. You see, medieval meals, especially at monasteries, were often eaten in a kind of holy hush. Monks chewed reverently. Nods replaced words. If you wanted more peas, a gesture would suffice. Conversations were saved for after the apple tarts and spiritual absolution. To this day, you may notice that many formal dinners lean toward quiet restraint at first, though this is often undone by Cousin Gregory's 3rd glass of wine and sudden opinions on politics. Even the "don't talk with your mouth full" rule has monastic roots. Not out of cleanliness, really, but because speech was seen as wasteful during nourishment. Food was fuel, not podcast fodder. And yet, monks weren't completely joyless. Some abbeys had official complainers, seriously, people whose job it was, at designated times, to read aloud and occasionally grumble about world affairs. So, The other monks didn't have to break their vows of silence. Imagine hiring someone to express your table frustrations. Brother Cedric, do kindly inform the cook that this porridge insults not only my tongue, but my ancestors. As our spoons settle gently into their silence, and the imaginary flicker of torchlight licks the stone walls of our minds, it's comforting to know that these traditions haven't entirely disappeared. They simply morphed into napkin folding tutorials, etiquette coaches, and that one friend who refuses to let you butter the bread before it's passed. So tuck the trencher under your pillow and rest well, dear sleeper. For in the next room, just beyond the comfort of your curtain wall, we'll whisper through the peculiar protocols of fasting, and why medieval people sometimes accidentally invented brunch. The sun had long since dipped behind the thatched rooftops of a medieval village, and the embers in the hearth were beginning their soft negotiation with darkness. It was the hour when chickens stopped pretending they were in charge, and peasants began discussing, quietly and sleepily, the eternal debate whether one could eat apples after cheese without courting death. There's an old saying, phrased most piously in 14th century Latin, Cassius est clavis ad claudendum stomachum, which roughly translates to, cheese is the key to close the stomach. It sounds like the sort of thing a priest would mutter after midnight while holding a particularly ominous-looking wheel of brie. But this wasn't just culinary superstition. It was the strict etiquette of a medieval meal, codified in damp manuscripts and grandmotherly wisdom. Meals were structured like sacred ceremonies. You opened the stomach with fruit, mostly soft ones, like figs or grapes, things that seemed unlikely to start an uprising in the gut. Then came the meats, if you were rich. If you weren't rich, you got beans pretending valiantly to be pigeons. Finally, you sealed the internal vault with cheese. Cheese was the full stop, the velvet curtain, the knight's visor lowering gently over the digestive drawbridge. Why this belly book-ending tradition? Apothecaries and proto-nutritionists of the era genuinely believed that different foods traveled through the body at different speeds, and a haphazard mixing of foods, say pears before piglet or ale after onions, could cause everything from bad dreams to philosophical despair. Well, technically, they thought it caused ill humours, which were not so much funny as they were phlegmatic or melancholic. The ideal medieval meal, according to physician Giles of Corbeil, began with light foods, built gradually toward heavier ones, and always included wine to soften dryness. Though if you had water instead, you could always pray really hard for divine enzymatic intervention. But here's where it gets cozy and curious. We still sort of do this, maybe without realizing it. We end dinners with a nice, tidy bit of cheese, or a digestive biscuit, which is a sort of edible thesis statement for everything that came before. In fine dining today, you'll still find courses arriving in gentle, gustatory crescendos, starting with a cleansing amuse-bouche and concluding with desserts so rich and decadent they could have been used as currency in medieval Bordeaux. And like those long-gone lords and ladies, we still deeply associate rituals around eating with decorum, pacing, and, let's be honest, digestive peace treaties. Sure, no one's consulting a book of humours at Applebee's, but the idea that eating slowly, in sequence, affects our well-being is alive and well. We just traded Latin for Instagram captions and swapped leeches for lemon seltzer. In castles, cheese wasn't just a meal ender. It was practically a ceasefire between dueling courses. Rich, tangy, and often riddled, accidentally, with veiny blue molds. It was a medieval marvel. Monasteries were known for their cheese-making talents, And some of those old recipes, likely whispered into goat ears for extra flavor, survive as artisanal favorites today. Even the idea of digestives, those mysterious little glasses of amber or herbal-scented bravery served after a feast, are a thread pulled straight from this cheese-ended tapestry. They were meant to signal stomachs to prepare for textile work, weaving together all those layers of roast boar, pickled turnips, and suspicious eel pies into something survivable. It was rule, not preference. Serve cheese before pears. That's culinary heresy. Fruit must open, cheese must close. Anything else was gastronomic anarchy. And for those breaking the order, why, may the saints intercede for your intestines. So next time you pause between dessert and coffee, or conspiratorially reach for a sliver of Gouda to settle things down, know that you're acting on traditions older than forks. You've unwittingly submitted your appetite to a very medieval rhythm, one that feared chaos in the gut so profoundly it created edible architecture. And speaking of architecture, the medieval mind didn't just organize food around health. It saw it as a ladder of moral importance. Certain things were naturally better to eat, but we'll climb that strange, crunchy hierarchy together, one virtuous bite at a time. It's hard to imagine a time when a spoon made you noble. But oh yes, there was such an era. In the grand medieval theatre of etiquette, your place at the feasting table said much about you, but what you held in your hand spoke volumes louder. And it wasn't always what you were eating, but how, with which precisely, and whether it had gold embossing. Now picture the distant glow of candlelight flickering across the stone walls of a manor hall. A pig roasts impressively on the spit. Minstrels flex their lutes in the corner like they're warming up for a medieval boy band. Come back, and at the long wooden table sit an assorted cast of lords, ladies, their children, known then chiefly for being small and extremely sticky, pilgrims of ambiguous purpose, and possibly a stray knight or two who misunderstood the calendar invite. And before them, trenchers. Ah yes, the trencher. Not quite a plate, not quite bread, but both in their own stubborn way. A thick slice of yesterday's bread, flattened for structural stability, and used to hold food before being, brace yourself, either eaten or handed out to the poor, assuming the gravy hadn't reached catastrophic saturation levels. This, dear listener, is where our modern table manners tiptoe out from the shadows of yeast-risen utility. Because medieval folks did not simply hurl themselves upon turkey legs with the abandon we'd like to romanticize. No. They had rules. And those rules filtered down the centuries with the tenacity of rogue parsley in your teeth after dinner. For instance, the no, elbows on the table rule. Blame it on communal trenchers. In those days, you were often sharing your edible dish with another person, typically someone only vaguely palatable. Elbows were discouraged because they hogged space and, more importantly, suggested you might lean in far too close to the other person's side of the meat pile. A social sin rivaled only by borrowing someone's spoon, without swapping vows first. Ah, and speaking of spoons, those were status symbols once. A medieval noble might carry their own spoon with them, sheathed in a little pouch on the belt, like a very underwhelming dagger. A fashion statement that whispered, I eat often and with subtle dignity. Forks, on the other hand, had a tougher time entering the scene. Introduced to Western Europe via Byzantium, forks were viewed with suspicion bordering on sacrilege. Why stab your food, they wondered, when God gave you operable fingers? In fact, using forks early on was so controversial bishops occasionally called them diabolical. It was believed that using slender metal prongs to eat your pottage was not only a feat, but one tassel away from heresy. Needless to say, this idea did not hold up, but it did leave us with a culinary ghost. Even today, there's something vaguely rebellious about eating pizza with a fork and knife. Unholy, even. As though you might be excommunicated from the late-night snack club. Now, we mustn't forget the social ritual of hand-washing before meals. Not just cleanliness, but ceremony. A servant might approach with a bowl and a jug and pour water over your hands before you dined. This wasn't done in solitude either. It was a performance. The guest of honor had their hand-washing paraded around like the crowning moment before a banquet. It's the origin of the polite wash your hands before dinner instruction, though considerably less exciting when you do it alone in a fluorescent lit bathroom, surrounded by motivational posters from 1997. And then, silence. Because in a well-run medieval hall, there were times when talking during meals was looked down upon. Not necessarily banned, but managed. Think of it as the first attempt at quiet restaurants, except rather than moody jazz playlists, there were rules like do not gnaw bones noisily, or do not belch forth words with thy mouth full of cheese. Yes, these were real, because somewhere, someone had done it loudly enough to warrant codification. So the next time you find yourself using a coaster, chewing with your mouth closed, or refraining mid-supper from reciting your thoughts on owls, remember, much of it traces back to a time when your worth was weighed at the table by whether you could handle a broth without slurping and resist sword-fighting the roast chicken when it came your way. In our next dreamy thought, we'll wander down into the surprisingly coded world of napkins, the cloth, the manners, the medieval drama of fabric, folds, and what not to do with one in front of a knight. If you've ever sat through a dinner party where someone insists on correct napkin placement or judges you for cutting your bread the wrong way, you may be shocked or lulled into discovering that much of that dinner table pomp actually began with the medieval concept of table manners, a term that once involved far fewer forks and far more fear of being exiled to the wrong end of the feast. To the medieval mind, etiquette wasn't just about being polite. It was survival in powdered form. A misplaced elbow might not get you merely scolded. It could mean demotion to the undesirable company of the goat herders and pie stuffers. You see, banquet seating was its own version of social architecture. Lord at the high table, knights below, squires somewhere near the door. It was less about dining and more about medieval feng shui with gravy. Now, if you're picturing an elegant, contemplative meal, think again. Medieval feasts were technically public performances with goose fat. People ate with their fingers, but not willy-nilly. Oh no, there were surprisingly specific finger rules. Using just the first 3 fingers of the right hand was encouraged. Pinky out was apparently a heresy in some duchies. The rationale? These were considered the noble fingers, which is frankly adorable. The pinky and thumb were labelled as rude, as if they gossiped behind the charger plate and drank too much ale at the last harvest festival. To be polite meant to appear refined while somehow shoveling mystery stew into your mouth without flinging lentils across the table. Also, bread, always bread. But not just as food, as utensil, napkin, and occasionally edible plate. This was the trencher, a slice of day-old loaf used to catch the bits of meat and sauce too slippery to trust your fingertips with. Once soaked and saturated with the meal's collective essence, the trencher was sometimes eaten. Other times, it was given to the poor or tossed to the hounds. Imagine going to dinner and leaving with someone else's gravy bread. It was the original takeout. in that you literally took it out to the alley. Interestingly, the medieval obsession with neatness didn't extend to wearing armor at dinner. Knights were known to dine in full chainmail, looking both gallant and slightly sweaty. There's something rather touching about imagining someone trying to gnaw on a goose leg with gauntlets on. They didn't have finger bowls, but if they had, someone would surely have dipped their sword in one. Drinking, too, was deeply codified. Wine was often cut with water to prevent it from, well, working too well. To drink it undiluted was frowned upon in polite households and considered a sign of civil unravelling. Meanwhile, clinking glasses. That came later. In the medieval period, you would raise your cup ever so slightly, a silent nod to health, or to not being poisoned, which was, at the time, quite a festive concern. Speaking of poison, there's a delightful, if mildly paranoid tradition that likely echoes the medieval obsession with table security. The modern habit of couples tasting bites from each other's plates. In castles filled with ambitious uncles and suspicious stepmothers, rulers often employed tasters to sample their food first. The modern dinner date flirt of "try my salmon" is, quite literally, a medieval defense mechanism light. People also refrained from talking too much while chewing, a tradition that we still pretend to enforce today, though with mixed success. But in medieval times, it wasn't just considered gross, it was evidence of poor family breeding. There were entire etiquette manuals instructing noble youth not to lick their fingers, slurp, or point with bones, which, now that you think about it, does still sound unappealing. And then there was hand washing, a ritual that arrived before and after the meal, with scented water poured over one's fingers by a servant, usually into a silver basin. This wasn't just hygienic, it was symbolic. Clean hands meant a clean conscience, and if nothing else, fewer roasted turnip crumbs in your beard. It's rather poetic, really. So many of our modern quirks, from the way we set the table to the way we instinctively reach across for the salt with an unspoken apology, carry echoes of a time when eating was theatre, politics, hygiene, and mild alchemy all at once. Somewhere in the flickering candlelight of a high medieval hall, perhaps someone reached for their trencher with the wrong finger, and the entire order of seating shifted dramatically down by one. A mistake, maybe, or an early version of social media's whoops moment, deleted not with a backspace, but with a sideways glance. And just as a flickering torch was replaced by candlelight, which gave way to electric bulbs, the rituals endured, softer, smaller, and unknowingly ancient, as shadows lengthen around the memory of those mead-soaked manners. We draw closer to the next comforting quirk, the curious commandment of the communal spoon. As twilight melted into the heavy hush of evening, and bread crusts staled quietly in their baskets, something peculiar settled over the medieval household. Not a ghost, but a habit, a ritual so old and mundane that it crept into the modern world wearing a disguise. It's something you likely do each day without question, a small act of etiquette wound tighter than a belt on a 14th century nobleman's doublet. And that act is not eating with your elbows on the table. Yes, the almighty elbow, so pointy, so controversial, so entirely misunderstood by modern diners. But long before mothers wagged their fingers at Sunday roasts, the arm on the table rule was a matter not merely of manners, but of spatial logistics and social hierarchy. Back in the medieval dining hall, think long wooden tables, flickering candlelight, and a suspiciously cheerful lute player. They didn't dine the way we think of feasting today. Meals weren't just about sustenance. They were choreographed affairs of status and spectacle. Seating was assigned not by comfort, but by class. If you were near the salt, a little fancy pyramid of mineral wealth, known as the salt cellar, you were very important indeed. If you were not, well, you were lucky to be fed with a spoon instead of your hands. Tables were narrow, just wide enough to hold platters of pottage and communal trenchers, those thick slices of day-old bread doubling as edible plates. Though, to be fair, they were often too stale to munch, and more commonly donated to the poor or the pigs. Elbows on such a narrow table could crowd your trencher-mate's space, or far worse, tip the carefully balanced roast peacock directly into Sir Geoffrey's lap. And so, elbows became the unwelcome guests at dinner. But like many things in the medieval playbook, this no elbows rule became less about practicality and more about propriety. Monks, chroniclers, and etiquette manuals, yes, they wrote those, began to moralize the elbow. Putting your arms on the table implied laziness, greed, even pride. In a world where sin hid in every corner like a puddle you forgot about, elbows became a kind of moral failing. Hands on the table, innocence. Elbows, gluttony's favorite pose. The fusion of furniture dimensions and spiritual anxiety led to the formal dining codes that trickled down over the centuries. So today, when someone gently scolds you for leaning in with chicken tenders clutched dramatically in hand, be comforted. You're grappling with 1,000 years of slippery social expectations, born with the sound of lute strings and the hiss of swan turning on a spit. But wait, speaking of cutlery, here's where things get curiouser. For quite some time, medieval banquets were forkless affairs. That's right, spoons were common, knives were, nearer at hand than a gossip. But forks, they had a rocky start in Europe. At first, food was conveyed to the mouth using fingers and bread platforms. No one thought it odd to dive wrist first into a pie. The fork, with its devilish little tines, was initially considered both bizarre and a bit suspicious, probably because it came from the East via Byzantium and was seen as both foreign and terribly effeminate. Using a fork was like wearing silk on a battlefield. Functional, but far too fabulous. It wasn't until the 11th century that forks began their slow, slippery rise through the ranks of acceptability. A Byzantine princess married into Venetian royalty and brought her fork habit with her. Her table manners, delicate, precise, and deeply forked, were viewed with grave concern. When she died young, a local priest openly speculated that it was divine punishment for her utensil arrogance. Yet by the 15th century, the fork was shaking off its scandal and finding its way into more refined circles. It wasn't so much a blessing as a truce. People began to fork without guilt, and elbow space finally began expanding. So when we sit today, elbows hovering politely at our sides, guiding our salad with a stainless steel trident, we're not just being proper. We're reenacting a centuries-old social ballet, one where etiquette was designed not just to show your breeding, but to keep your neighbour from ending the meal with a ladle in his eye. As candles burn lower in the dining hall of memory, and the chatter of nobles turns into the murmur of dreams, we can lean back, gently, elbowless, and listen for the soft clink of history settling into its chair. Somewhere beyond the rustle of velvet napkins and ghostly silver spoons, a new aroma drifts in, something sweet, with cinnamon. But wait, didn't sugar used to be a spice? Let's wander quietly into the next course of our tale. As twilight lingers across the cobbled courtyards of medieval imagination, let us drift into the curious realm of tablecloths. Not just any tablecloths, mind you, but the profoundly noble textiles that once served as silent referees in the lively theatre of mealtime morality. In the medieval dining room, which was often just a repurposed hall with less hay on the floor, the arrival of the tablecloth signaled not the start of dinner, but the dawn of civilization. A white cloth folding softly over a long wooden table was more than a decorative flourish. It was a perimeter, a boundary, a woven code of conduct. For starters, the tablecloth protected the table, often an expensively carved treasure in wealthier halls, from goose grease, wine mishaps, and the occasional enthusiastic elbow. But it performed another more symbolic function. It told you where your place was, literally. Piece of cloth, peace of mind. You see, the medieval table was a subtle social map, woven with threads of hierarchy. At the top, seated before the salt, was the lord, the lady, or the most important guest. Sometimes all three, sometimes none, depending on who had the plague that week. Below the salt, quite literally, sat the rest. Lesser nobles, lesser cousins, and the cousin nobody spoke of after the incident with the pheasant. Above the salt and below the salt were not just phrases, they were coordinates in the great medieval game of status. The precious salt cellar, resplendent and strategically placed near the honoured end of the table, separated the important from the merely edible, and the tablecloth spilled across this whole hierarchy like a velvet river of quiet social pressure. But here's where it gets sneakily relevant to your modern life. If you've ever set a table for guests, plated the forks just so, smoothed out the table runner with troubling precision, or fretted over napkin placement, you are haunted, gently, by the medieval table ethos. We are still trying, with placemats and linen serviettes, to recreate the orderliness of a feast that once depended on cloth boundaries to keep chaos and the peasantry at bay. And let's talk napkins. In the early Middle Ages, there were no individual napkins. There was the communal hand towel, a long strip of fabric hanging from the table, or the lord's private towel boy. Yes, that was a job. This towel was used for wiping fingers after a particularly enthusiastic meat course, and possibly for punishing anyone who reached for food with greasy hands. If you were lucky, it was changed between courses. If not, well, finger-licking good took on a new urgency. Eventually, as modesty and hygiene began their slow, flirtatious waltz into upper-class life, individual napkins emerged. One might be given a square of linen entirely to oneself. No need to share with a neighbouring knight who just plundered his way through the roast boar. Individual napkins cried out, "We are not animals," a sentiment frequently disproved by the subsequent table behaviour, and the etiquette didn't end with cloth. The way one used the cloth mattered. One did not blow one's nose into it, unless one wanted to find oneself dining quite literally outside the castle next time. Cleaning your knife, however, totally acceptable. Gently dabbing your lips, expected. Tying it into a swan, unclear but ambitious, as forks slowly edge their way onto the dinner scene. Not embraced in England until the 1600s, mind you. The role of the cloth only deepened. Without forks, you ate with fingers, which meant your napkin and your neighbour's tolerance worked overtime. So important was the maintenance of dignity that nobles trained in proper wiping. Imagine an etiquette class where the central lesson is dabbing, not stabbing. Now, in your home, where napkins may be paper and nobody is judging your fork grip, probably, the echoes of this cloth culture remain. That moment before a meal when everything looks just right, soup spoons aligned, glasses glinting, and a fabric square waiting politely beside the plate. That is medieval yearning dressed in modern hospitality. Even the phrase laying the table comes from this. The table was literally laid, all parts assembled, cloths unfurled, salt placed with almost religious reverence. The table did not exist in one form all day. It was summoned, like a benevolent spirit, at mealtime. And when dinner ended, it often vanished again, leaving only the crumbs and rumours. As stars gather outside our imagined stone windows, we tiptoe away from the linen-covered tables of the past. Behind us, lords recline, goblets tilted, and somewhere, a towel boy breathes a sigh of relief. Next, let's peer into the buttery, a place far less dairy-filled than you might suppose. Back in the candlelit kitchens of medieval England, long before Yelp reviews or TikTok chefs, an unspoken rule settled over noble feasts and peasant potlucks alike. Thou shalt not mix sweet and savoury, unless thou art a wizard, or possibly French. And even then, proceed with caution. One had to choose wisely. To blend salt with sugar was to flirt with confusion, like wearing your shoes on the wrong feet or accidentally addressing the bishop as Dad. This ancient food taboo might be why Grandma still raises an eyebrow when you put pineapple on pizza. Sorry, Hawaii. The Middle Ages simply did not approve. But that doesn't mean medieval folks didn't enjoy sweetness. They just had very specific rules about when it was allowed to show up, like an awkward cousin at a wedding. Sweet came at the end, period, for dessert. It was not to cavort among the meats and broths and pickled eels unless carefully disguised. Spices were a different story, a juicy one in fact. A pinch of cinnamon on your lamb stew, perfectly acceptable. Cloves in your beef pie, encouraged. Remember, this was the age of edible showmanship. They didn't just dine, they performed. The more you could afford, the more spices got, sprinkled like medieval glitter. Nutmeg was not just a spice, it was a status symbol. One that you and only you had the key to grate. Of course, peasant diets were more restrained, out of necessity rather than choice. If you're picturing a rustic bread bowl with hearty stew and a dash of rosemary, you have been lied to. Think more along the lines of chunky pottage. Pottage was not a recipe so much as a genre, a slow-simmered mystery, thick with barley, root vegetables, and whatever else had the decency to grow nearby. Leeks were popular. They were loyal. Turnips came and went. And sometimes, if the gods smiled, there might be a sliver of bacon involved, usually reserved for Sundays or after a baptism. Now, between the rich and the poor, there arose a mysterious food code, what one might call the eating order. It shaped meals for centuries and, curiously, still shapes our dinner tables. That's right. If you've ever been mildly anxious about eating dessert before, dinner, blame a monk with a fondness for figs. The medieval banquet followed a ceremony of courses, arranged to flatter the stomach like an honoured guest. Tart foods first, they believed, awakened digestion. Tartness was the medieval espresso shot. That's why pickled vegetables might arrive before bread, and why you might still unconsciously nibble on olives before your main course today, long after forgetting who gave you that rule in the first place. Then came the roast meats, rich sauces, and golden pastries stuffed with pigeon, fish, or whatever was locally alarming. Finally, after the meal bowed itself out, there appeared subtlety, literally a subtlety. These were sculpted sweets, architectural marvels of marzipan and sugar paste, shaped into hedgehogs, castles, or saints. Sometimes they moved, sometimes they sang, and sometimes they caught fire. Medieval sugar art was brave like that. Even the concept of eating in silence, yes, even that has roots in this peculiar era. Head tables were at times grave affairs, where conversation was kept to whispers, and the loudest sound was your lord slurping wine with a contemplative frown. The idea that dinner should be sacred, that food deserved reverence, well, it might explain why you feel a twinge of guilt answering a text during a nice meal, centuries later. Then again, medieval silence was occasionally broken by a jester diving headfirst into a pudding, so things balanced out. One last curious inheritance: the medieval belief that certain food pairings should be avoided because they would unsettle your humours. A cold food like cucumber paired with another cold food like cheese. Catastrophic. Warm beer with wet cherries. You are asking for a stomach rebellion. In modern life, we express this less with humours and more with pop phrases. Doesn't sit right. Gives me heartburn. Or that burrito was a mistake. But it's the same ghostly superstition haunting our fridges. Whether we know it or not, we're still following rules codified not by science, but by the guy in charge of provisioning salted herring for the king's niece's wedding. And frankly, he did pretty well. Let's just say there's more to explore when it comes to medieval drinks, which could hydrate, heal, or leave you arguing with the firewood. But that is a toast for another chapter. In the low firelight of a medieval kitchen, nestled in the heart of a timber-framed manor, a curious little law was busy influencing your modern dinner table. Not by choice, of course. Laws seldom knock before entering history. This particular one involved apples and knives. Specifically, the notion that you should never, under any circumstances, cut fruit with your dinner knife. Not because it was rude, no, much worse, because they believed it might actually give you indigestion. In the Middle Ages, knives lived dramatic lives. These weren't the butter-smooth, stainless, steel companions we know today. No, these blades were sharp, personal, and often travelled everywhere with their owners, sort of like the medieval iPhone, but pointier. Guests were expected to bring their own cutlery to a meal, a practice known as bjok, bring your own knife. Politeness dictated that you never licked it. Unfortunately, that wasn't always respected, especially by knights who had probably been in chainmail for 14 straight hours and really needed that pair. But back to the apples. Cutting fruit was more than a culinary act. It danced somewhere between superstition and science. Fruit, especially raw, was considered dangerous to eat, which is a delightful bit of forgotten wisdom now that we put kale in smoothies and call it detox. Slicing an apple could be seen not just as gastronomic folly, but as a digestive gamble. Better, they felt, to stew it gently with a bit of honey, serve it warm in a trencher, and let your inner organs breathe a sigh of relief. Ironically, and here's the sleepy kicker, we still live by these rules, sort of. The lingering etiquette of not using your dinner knife on fruit at the table is a genteel ghost left behind by these medieval knife fears. Watch someone at a formal banquet today. They might use a fruit spoon, a dainty fork, or simply let the melon come pre-diced and socially acceptable. All because centuries ago, someone decided that slicing an apple might anger the humours. Ah yes, the humours. The much beloved, utterly baffling medieval theory that your health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Clean table manners weren't just about being polite. They were a full-body commitment to avoiding an imbalance of bile, which may be why the cook, or more grandly, the master of the kitchens, carried more prestige than an accountant in a plague year. These culinary curators knew which foods caused melancholy, which provoked lust, and which were acceptable to eat on an empty stomach without inviting divine punishment. Meats, for instance, had ranks. Roast swan, a nobleman's delight. Roast hedgehog, only if you were both desperate and emotionally prepared. And fruit, served last, always. To sweep your system with sweetness, the culinary version of concluding a Gregorian chant with a whistle. And in some twinkling way, our modern dessert course nods back to this, not just because we like sugar, but because medieval scholars convinced themselves that ending with something delicate and cool would coax your inner self into balanced bliss, which is exactly why a chilled panna cotta might just be a 21st century chant for digestive equilibrium. Curiously, these customs crawled their way into your cutlery drawer too. The concept of dessert-specific utensils, those impossibly tiny forks and oddly sloped spoons, was born from the medieval obsession with food order, temperature, and texture. If your ancestors served pears stewed in spiced wine, someone had to invent a tool delicate enough to honor that pear. Thus, the teaspoon, a humble relic of a time when credible scholars debated whether cucumbers could start wars. Of course, medieval mealtimes weren't all medicinal gloom. They were long, lavish affairs filled with music, storytelling, and hundreds of curious rules, like not crossing your knife and spoon, lest you signal a duel, or avoiding clinking your goblet too loudly, which could awaken a table-dwelling demon. It was a dinner party, yes, but also a moral lesson, a spiritual exercise, a theatrical performance of etiquette, balanced precariously atop a trench of roasted venison. So the next time you slice a pear at the table with something other than your teeth, think of it as a quiet act of historical rebellion. You, a connoisseur of calm defiance, casually undermining centuries of medieval stomach theory. And speaking of rebellion, some of the most surprising rules around food had nothing to do with daily mealtimes at all, but were instead dictated by faith and fasting, which often involved some intricate culinary acrobatics and a very confused fish. But that curiosity belongs just ahead, softly simmering on the edge of memory, waiting to be stirred. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval great hall, the warmth and bustle of a feast offered more than just full bellies and spilled mead. It was a theatre of unwritten rules. Plates groaned under trenches of bread, joints of roasted venison, and pottages that defied classification. But beneath the clanging goblets and boisterous laughter was a silent choreography, a social ballet that governed the dinner table more tightly than any royal ordinance. You could roast a swan upside down and dye a stew purple with saffron and almond milk. But heaven forbid you used your own spoon when the host offered his. Spoiler: we do some of these things today, without even realizing we're reenacting centuries-old manners with every clink of the cutlery. Take, for example, the curious etiquette of seating. In those dusty days of honor and infrequent bathing, where you sat during supper immediately communicated your rank, your wealth, and how much of a potential heirloom your tunic's buttons were. The highest of the high sat at the high table, aptly named, usually up on a raised platform like the evening's prized roast. The closer to this noble stage you were, the more prestigious your position. Far from the dais, commoners dined in the culinary shadow of the elite. Today, we whisper judgments based on where someone's seated at a wedding reception. Coincidence? Or the ghost of medieval dinner elitism fermenting like forgotten cider? And then there's the curious matter of hand washing. In modern times, we're told by animated soap dispensers and stern airport signs to scrub for 20 seconds, preferably while humming a tune. But in the medieval world, washing one's hands before a meal wasn't hygiene. Not really. It was a ritual, a performance. Servants would parade around the hall with basins and sweet-smelling water, allowing guests to purify their fingertips before dipping them into shared stews and communal meat piles. Today's insistence on hand sanitizer at buffet tables might not be so new after all. Just add a little rosewater and some medieval flair, and you've got yourself a practically mandatory ceremony with roots in feudal courtesy. Then there's the spoons. Oh, the spoons. You may not have put much thought into your spoon lately. Perhaps it hangs loyally in your cutlery drawer, never far from its fork companion. But in medieval households, spoons were personal and portable. Much like a favorite pair of gloves or a cherished gossip, you brought your own. Your spoon, usually carved from wood or forged from pewter, was a giveaway to your personality and class. Arriving at a noble feast without a spoon was a bit like showing up to a dinner party today and asking for a fork while holding a bowl of hot risotto. A faux pas of the highest culinary order. Even stranger, guests almost never touch their food with fingers, unless sanctioned. That is, unless they were of particularly rugged stock or dining on something designed to be grasped, like a leg of lamb or an apple filched from the monastery's orchard. There were even rules about which portions of the hand could be licked clean and which finger should never be sucked at table. Hint, the pinky was strictly off limits. Very genteel. A modern echo of this still ripples through today's slightly apologetic finger-licking, preferably done in secret behind a napkin fortress. Speaking of napkins, the medieval version wasn't something you plopped into your lap. Oh no. That handy little flap of etiquette hadn't been invented yet. Instead, guests wiped greasy fingers on large communal cloths draped across the table or passed during the meal. Picture an enormous table-sized towel everyone shared. Now imagine doing that today in a Michelin-starred restaurant. Oddly charming, inconvenient, possibly alarming. And lest you think modern foodies invented tasting menus and artful restraint, remember, medieval meals also featured course after course, each growing in grandeur and often preceded by a void course of candied ginger or aniseed to awaken the digestion. Sound familiar? Swap candied fennel seeds for an entree, amuse-bouche, and you'll start spotting medieval ghosts lurking in the gourmet shadows. Feasts were not just lavish dinner parties. They were political performance. Invitations could carry favor. Orders of dishes whispered your significance. To eat alongside a lord was to be momentarily gilded in social gold. And even now, we accept invitations, RSVP, dress accordingly, and carefully time our arrival like minor counts at an earl's evening repast. So whether you cradle your soup spoon just so, glance at your neighbour's silverware to confirm which bread plate is yours, or instinctively ask, where shall I sit? At a dinner party, remember, you're participating in a 1,000-year-old ritual, one where the ghosts of banquets past nod silently in approval. Up next, let's amble softly from the great hall to the underbelly of the kitchens, where rules took on a smokier, steamier form, and roasting a goose the wrong way could ruin your prospects for marriage. As the candlelight of history flickers across the checkerboard tables of yesteryear, let's ease into one of the most suspiciously enduring relics of medieval manners, the curious concept that one mustn't, under any circumstance, begin eating until everyone is served, A lovely social grace today, but back in the days of chainmail and questionable plumbing, it was not about etiquette. Oh no, it was about survival. Picture it. A long wooden table sagging under simmering stews, hard cheese, trenchers carved from day-old bread, and suspiciously enthusiastic jellied eels. Nobles and squires, monks and merchants, all politely refraining from stabbing their stuffed goose until the lord of the feast had been served his garnished peacock. Not because they were courteous, per se, but because taking a premature bite could be, let's say, terminal. Poisoning, you see, was not just a plot device for mystery novels. It was a genuine occupational hazard among nobles, rival families, or just someone trying to cut down the guest list for next week's harvest dance. In fact, the medieval elite developed an entire liturgy of dining rituals based on not dying during supper. The wait until the host eats bit was central. If Lord Burgelhelm took a bite and spontaneously foamed at the mouth, you politely declined the pigeon pie. Even kitchen staff were sometimes subjected to a sinister lottery known as the taster. Poor Joffrey the kitchen boy might be called upon to test the spiced wine or honey-roasted hedgehog. If, say, 10 minutes passed without him clutching his throat and performing a dramatic final soliloquy, the banquet would proceed. And so the rule was set. No one dines until the head of the table does. A law of etiquette by necessity. And yet it lingers on today, stubborn as a meat pie crust. Think of weddings, formal dinners, or those dreadful corporate luncheons where you hover awkwardly over your roast beef sandwich, glancing around like you're waiting for a tiny trumpet to toot, "You may chew now." In the medieval era, waiting wasn't idle. It was a public performance of allegiance and suspicion management. Seating order alone meant everything. Everyone looked to the host like he was both king and canary in a coal mine. Dining was less about nourishment and more about surviving the evening. Even dining implements weren't innocent. Take forks, for instance, once regarded with medieval suspicion bordering on theological outrage. By the time forks appeared in Europe, some church leaders actually condemned them as excessively delicate, because God probably meant for us to wrangle our parsnips with knives and divine enthusiasm. So when forks did catch on slowly and gingerly, they were considered almost seductive. Eating with one's hands, on the other hand, was still perfectly holy, if you'd washed, of course. And there's the rub, washing. Another rule passed down from medieval tables. Wash your hands before dining, but not for hygiene, of course. Bathing was a seasonal sport back then. The washing ritual before meals was mostly ceremonial. A splash of water poured over your fingers by a servant bearing a slightly irritated expression, and a bowl. But the symbolism was strong. It marked the transition from grubby survival to sacred supper. It was dining theatre, high-stakes snacking with rules we now treat as quaint. But to them, a quick lick of your spoon or an unsanctioned nibble might communicate treachery, or worse, poor breeding. Of course, common folk had fewer worries about poison, and no Joffrey on standby. But even in the humbler households, where supper was a one-pot affair and elbows were perfectly acceptable on the table, waiting for the head of the household to eat first became a quiet act of deference. And with time, it transformed from a cautionary wait into a display of manners. And so today, when Aunt Mildred narrows her eyes at you across the mashed potatoes because you've dared take a bite before Cousin Reginald received his dinner roll, know that her scowl is powered by roughly 700 years of historical momentum. These holdovers from medieval paranoia and peacock pie have been dusted off, woven into the soft fabric of good manners, and passed down through generations. what was once a strategy for social and gastric survival is now the tender choreography of modern dining. Soon, we'll sip something a little stranger still, a dish so sacred and baffling that it required its own set of rules, knights, and occasionally a trumpet. But for now, let the imaginary banquet pause and drift gently toward sleep, surrounded by invisible servants discreetly tasting your soup, just in case, as twilight settled over another medieval evening, a time when all good peasants were presumably asleep and all noblemen were reclining in embroidered discomfort. Something peculiar echoed across the centuries. The soft rattle of a fork. Yes, the fork. That elegant little trident you now stab into your Tuesday night fusilli was once the medieval equivalent of a scandal. If spoons were respected and knives admired, forks were suspicious. In fact, if you were to appear at a 12th century banquet brandishing a metal prong with nonchalant confidence, you'd likely be accused of either foreign sorcery or dreadful manners. This was not because the fork was unknown. Ancient Persians and Byzantines had embraced it like an old friend. But because, in much of medieval Europe, forks were considered either decadent, impractical, or oddly personal. You see, the idea of eating with something that mimicked tiny fingers struck people as mildly blasphemous and unnecessarily fancy. After all, the human hand came with 5 fully functioning fork-like digits for free. Why invent another? Besides, medieval food was designed to be grasped. A slice of trencher bread, that old edible plate, bore roasted meats and stewed vegetables in manageable clumps. Diners tore, dipped and scooped. The notion of gently puckering your lips around a tine-laden utensil seemed equal parts absurd and vaguely intimate. Some thought the touching of lips to metal smacked of vanity and vice, a sentiment which, to be fair, makes you question half of modern cutlery. It wasn't until the 14th and 15th centuries that forks began sneaking in through the back kitchens of nobility, one imported habit at a time. Italian elites, always a bit ahead of their time and their table manners, began using forks for pasta, which, if you've ever tried eating spaghetti with a spoon and a dream, makes perfect sense. Still, in broader medieval Europe, the fork remained something of an outsider, an aristocratic pretender to the throne of the hand. Entire etiquette manuals were written on how to not offend hosts by using one. But enough about table tools. Let us now turn our attention to another deceptively modern habit: washing one's hands before a meal. Today, it's a basic rule, drummed into every child and reinforced with songs about germs who wear tap shoes. But in the Middle Ages, hand washing at the table was its own sacred rite, intricately performed and socially coded. Before you ate, especially at a noble feast, a servant might approach with a basin of warm, rose-scented water, backed up by another assistant with a towel fluffed like a swan. Guests extended their hands over the bowl, not merely to cleanse, but also to signal their status and self-control. The higher your rank, the more elaborate your hand-washing. Think of it as the medieval version of choosing between paper napkins and linen folded into a peacock. Oddly enough, this cleanliness rarely extended past the wrists. Full baths were seasonal events, often taken with the solemnity of a church procession. But spot washing the hands, that was a must. Not for hygiene, mind you. No one had yet invented the phrase germ theory, but because greasy fingers smeared on your neighbor's sleeve could start minor wars. And war, while excellent for poetry and ransom, really delayed dessert. Interestingly, the timing of hand washing often indicated the progress of the meal. Wash before to show respect. wash after to signal the end. Nobles even had designated silver bowls, paraded about like ceremonial props, their clang announcing transitions long before the invention of waiters saying, "Will there be anything else tonight?" And if you were ever wondering why we still say things like finger foods or insist on folding napkins as if auditioning for a cloth-based ballet, you can thank medieval food rules for that lingering choreography. So many little rituals surrounding food, from not resting your elbows on the table to cutting quietly rather than stabbing enthusiastically, echo back to those old halls of drafty castles and firelit banquets. Even our odd obsession with pairing foods, wines with cheeses, meats with sauces, biscuits with atmospheric lighting, traces a lineage to medieval kitchen hierarchies where sauces were crafted to balance humours and unsettle Satan. And the sauces. But we'll get to those. They were potent enough to raise eyebrows and sometimes kingdoms. Let us drift gently toward the next morsel of insight, where the sauce wasn't just for taste, but sometimes a matter of medical and moral survival. As twilight deepens across the manor's kitchen garden, we find ourselves wrestling delicately with one of the most subtle, strange, and surprisingly long-lived medieval food taboos, the curious war on snacking. Yes, snacking. That supposedly modern, oh-so-casual habit of nibbling between meals, of popping grapes into your mouth while pretending to clean, or constructing a cheese and cracker tower while texting about how late dinner's going to be. It turns out, medieval society had very strong opinions about all that extra morsel mischief. So much so, in fact, that it would have earned you more moral suspicion than actual gluttony at banquet, because the real sin was not how much you ate, but how properly you did it. Let's imagine ourselves in a 14th century English household. The bell tolls for the midday meal, known as dinner back then, and everyone heads to the great hall in a highly choreographed procession that resembles less a meal and more a religious ceremony with spoons. Food appears in lavish procession, guarded by bread trenchers and flanked by goblets that, quite possibly, still believed in the concept of modesty. You eat, you pause between courses, you try very hard not to knock anything over with your elaborate sleeve. Then you stop, and you wait for grace to be spoken again. And once that final prayer is said, that's it. That is all. The kitchen is officially closed. Wandering off for a kitchen raid later to find a cold leg of roast, that would be a scandal. The concept of opening the pantry at 11 p.m. to find something light, perhaps a bit of goat cheese and an introspective fig, would horrify your average medieval host. Such food improvisation was considered profoundly undisciplined, a kind of culinary trespass. Why? Because order was everything. The structure of daily meals mirrored a societal belief in hierarchy. Just as you had kings, lords, knights, footmen, and the guy who held the napkins, you also had breakfast, dinner, and supper, each meal arriving like a well-dressed noble with an RSVP. Interfering with that schedule was like a peasant suddenly deciding to be pope on a Wednesday. Absolutely not. Interestingly, the act of grazing was tied up in suspicions about overindulgence, what they called gluttony. Not gluttony, as in finishing an entire pie, mind you, but gluttony, as in eating in an unsanctified way. Even a subtle bite of bread outside maintaining the choreography of meals was considered evidence of loose habits, and no one wanted their character referenced on a parchment like John the Miller, fond of snacks, likely chaotic. This couldn't have been pleasant for the medieval equivalent of the late-night fridge opener. Imagine Hugh the baker lurching around the pantry at dusk, reaching for a fig tart under cover of darkness and having to justify it to his confessor in the morning. "Forgive me, Father, for I have munched." Despite all this, people did sneak food. Of course they did. Humans have never successfully stuck to rules about food since time began. Monks wrote entire treatises about resisting the temptation of apples after compline. Women would tuck extra morsels into their garments to nibble in private. Children were caught with cheese in creative hiding places. The impulse to snack was simply too powerful. So while the official line was 3 meals, mind your manners, the unofficial motto whispered in kitchens in the dead of night may well have been, just one more bite. And speaking of things that wormed their way into modern life, consider the structure of our own daily eating. For all we pride ourselves on liberation through takeout apps and fridge cards, we still live by mealtime slots. Breakfast at 7, or else you are late. Lunch window opens roughly between 11 and 2. Dinner becomes sacred, sometimes falsely adorned with candles, to prove that one is not just hungry, but civilized. And snacking, to this day, still carries a whiff of guilty pleasure. That furtive chocolate, the surreptitious spoonful of peanut butter at midnight. Each one carries a trace of medieval tension. It's the modern version of gluttony, but in stretchy pants. And then there's the intricate etiquette still woven into our eating decorum. Don't reach across the table. Use your proper utensils. Begin only when everyone is seated. All born from centuries of food as performance, food as proof of status, food as demonstration of your ability to wield a spoon without revealing your baser instincts. But then, perhaps there is some softness in this enduring structure. Even now, the quiet ritual of a shared meal can feel like something sacred, something older than ourselves. So the next time you sit down for dinner, or second dinner disguised as late supper, think kindly of the medieval soul who snuck a tart from the larder and hoped no one would notice. And as the candlelight flickers across the stone walls of memory, let's follow the scent of something richer, something spicier, perhaps a clue hidden in the very sauces we still drizzle without knowing just how medieval they might be. Back in the misty heart of the Middle Ages, etiquette was not just about elbows off the table. It was about avoiding disease, maintaining your honor, and not accidentally starting a minor war over soup. A good dinner guest knew the unspoken rules of the table, or else risked being banned from the banquet or beheaded. But don't worry, tonight's tale is much less perilous and far cozier. Let's peer into one of these surprisingly familiar customs, the ceremonial reverence for the napkin. Yes, the humble napkin. The square of fabric that quietly plays both hero and understudy at every meal. We barely notice it today unless we spill something on ourselves, or mistakenly think it's origami when faced with a fancy restaurant's rogue swanfold. But in the medieval world, the napkin had gravitas. Before forks became dinner table regulars, eating with your hands was standard fare, particularly the right hand, because the left was considered ungodly or, let's just say, busy with other hygiene-related tasks. So, after a hearty scoop of stew with one's fingers, the question arose, where to wipe? Enter the napkin. In manor houses and castles alike, lavish feasts were served with fine linens draped across shoulders, sewn into coats, or, rather delightfully, laid on individual diners' laps depending on status. In fact, there were entire job positions in noble households dedicated solely to managing napkins and hand-washing routines. The you factor was actually quite organized. For example, a good host provided a basin and ewer for guests to wash their hands before and after the meal. Sometimes, water was infused with herbs and citrus to cleanse and lightly scent the fingers. A spa day for the knuckles, if you will. A towel, blessedly clean, was then offered for drying. Napkin culture, whether draped or folded, became symbolic of wellness, civility, and how well you paid attention at etiquette school. Using your sleeve, gasp, would have been a social catastrophe. Even more charming, there were silent rules about how one used the napkin. Dabbing delicately at the lips signaled refinement. Anything approaching a scrub might imply you had either poor breeding or aggressive soup. One should also never return a soiled napkin to the platter or communal linen pile. This was essentially food-adjacent biohazard. Medieval dinner parties, it seems, were an elegant minefield of do's and don'ts masquerading as merriment. Now, let's fast forward you gently to the present day. You're out to lunch with a friend. You instinctively place a cloth napkin on your lap without a thought. Is this your innate charm and social grace? Certainly. But it also whispers of 1,000-year-old dining code passed hand to hand, napkin to lap, like medieval muscle memory. You don't dip your fingers into a shared platter without a care. You don't wipe your mouth on the tablecloth, despite perhaps very tempting spaghetti. And thank goodness you no longer need to carry your own portable linen stitched to your outfit like a wearable bib for grown-ups. We might not bow before basins or offer rosemary-scented fingertips to our guests, but the ghost of gallant table manners hasn't quite left us. It just tidied itself into modern form. Mildly starchier, often white, occasionally with those weird pressed creases restaurants think make them look fancier. It's strange and delightful how certain habits sneak past centuries of innovation, war, and the dishwasher. The rituals we think of as innate politeness are, in fact, tiny echoes of a table once lit by flickering torches and served by wenches who vehemently did not want you using your tunic as a napkin. So the next time you slide a paper napkin discreetly over your lap at a picnic or a dinner party, you can smile gently into your lemonade glass, knowing with sleepy certainty that your hands are clean, your manners are medieval, and your participation in this centuries-old art is frankly adorable. In the next glow of candlelight, or maybe LED-powered salt lamps, we'll explore something less tidy, but no less traditional. A food rule so powerful that entire kingdoms considered it divine, and the rest of us just buttered it. There's a good chance that today you are obeying a medieval food rule without even realizing it. And it's this: dessert comes last. Not because it's sweet, not because pudding must wait its turn, but because, in the rolling centuries of medieval feasting, it was believed that the order of dishes could literally control the chaos in your humours. Yes, the humours. Our imaginary internal buffet of yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm, each with their own medieval personality disorder. Balancing these inner fluids was, according to doctors in fur-lined robes and suspiciously opulent hats, the key to health. Put simply, start your meal the wrong way and your spleen might throw a tantrum. So courses were ordered not for flavour, but for temperature, moisture, and moral character. You began with the light, dry things to open the stomach. Think spices in wine, slices of quince, or if you were unlucky, hedgehog pate. Not a joke, my friend. These appetizers were supposed to awaken your system, like a trumpet fanfare before the digestion army mustered its troops. Next came boiled meats, gently warmed, kind, fatherly foods that comforted your belly like a velvet-cloaked uncle reading you psalms. Roasted things came later, kicking in like an especially rowdy lute band. Heavy foods were escorted in while your digestive fire was fully stoked, as it were, lest they sit undigested and putrefy, a favourite word in medieval medical texts, and only when the stomach was groaning with gratitude, or groaning generally, would dessert arrive. Sweet, warm, spiced, things like stewed cherries in rose water, candied fennel, seeds, or little almond wafers. These foods weren't merely indulgent little footnotes. They were part of the health strategy. They sealed the stomach. Yes, sealed it. Like corking a ship to keep bad winds out. You see, foods at the end of the meal were believed to close the digestive gate and prevent the escape of, how do we put this delicately, miasmas of regret. This belief was so culturally embedded that it survived all the way into our polite modern habit of asking, now, shall we look at the dessert menu? Even when we're already full, squinty-eyed, and slightly ashamed of the third bread basket. We're not hungry. We're just medieval deep down in our gastromorals. But lest you think this was all about the gut, consider the symbolic messages. In medieval Europe, a feast was also a social signal. Courts performed piety and power through their food. The course order mirrored the expected spiritual order of the cosmos. Begin light, ascend to the glorious, and rich, descend sweetly to closure. It was not just dinner. It was a moral parabola, with gravy. And speaking of symbolism, desserts were sometimes shaped as tiny visual jokes. On particularly festive tables, you might find a moulded marzipan castle siege with candied night storming sugar walls, or a fig-stuffed peacock, feathers reattached, looking mysteriously alive, perhaps slightly resentful. Was it delicious? Dubiously. Was it hilarious? Dear listener, in 1398, yes, of course timing extended beyond course order. One must not eat at ungodly hours, for the devil was said to loiter near the larders after dark. Snacking was neither chic nor safe. Midnight fridge raids would have been considered culinary heresy, unless you were pregnant, drunk, or both. But the true miracle is how these feasting frameworks still echo today. That well-worn structure of starter, main, dessert. You can thank the monks, the manor kitchens, and 1,000 years of gastrointestinal theorizing for that. So next time you find yourself politely deferring dessert until after the meal, perhaps give a quiet nod to the medieval mindset. You, my friend, are sealing your stomach with sugary armor, protecting your inner harmony with tiramisu, keeping the putrefactions at bay, one creme brulee at a time. But just how did medieval hosts deal with guests who didn't obey the order? Guests who mixed their meats and pears willy-nilly? What social institutions were birthed out of the need to tame unruly eating? That, dear sleeper, is a tale best nibbled slowly in the savoury story ahead. And so, with candlelight flickering against timbered walls and the scent of rosemary stubbornly clinging to the rushes underfoot, we tiptoe now into yet another curiously lasting legacy of medieval food rules, one nestled quietly between the etiquette of feast days and the fearful hush of monastic kitchens, the sacred ritual known as not talking with your mouth full. Yes, dear listener, that hallowed silence mid-chew, so often enforced by grandmothers, substitute teachers, and awkward first dates, has deeper historical roots than you might suspect. Let's gently crack open the crust of time and see what's been baking beneath. In medieval Europe, speech at the dining table was not only a matter of decorum, but also a matter of survival. Picture this: a raftered hall echoing with laughter, dogs scraping for bones, a lute possibly playing off-key in the corner. To speak during a meal, especially with one's mouth full, risked more than a splash of stew on your neighbour. It risked social excommunication, or worse, being labelled as vulgar, a word which in its original form didn't mean crude, but simply common. Oh, the horror. Monasteries were especially strict about dining decorum. Silent meals were normal, expected, and even welcomed. Rather than chatter over their barley broth, monks used hand signals to communicate, not unlike medieval mime artists with strong opinions about lentils. This practice wasn't just about peace and focus, it was about holiness. A quiet mouth was, after all, less likely to sin. Even in secular households, talking while chewing was associated with the wrong sort of crowd, those who lacked rationale and restraint. Two traits medieval moralists prized nearly as much as a properly fermented cheese. Manuals for young noblemen often instructed them in dining like gentlefolk. Hold your knife correctly, break your bread with your hands instead of biting directly from the loaf like some peasant wolverine. And whatever you do, do not speak whilst masticating. Why? Because people were watching. The table was a stage and everyone had a role to play. Just as minstrels plucked songs of valour and chivalry, you aspiring courtier, you sausage in training, had to demonstrate that you possessed enough control not to send lentil spittle onto Lord Greystone's tabard. And the consequences? Oh, they could be dire. Not in the gallows sort of way, but in the sideways glance and polished disdain kind. One bad chew chatter, and you might find yourself moved to the end of the table, next to the cousins. You know the ones. Interestingly, the governances around speaking at meals even inspired the format of certain prayers. Pre-meal blessings and post-meal thanksgivings became their own little sanctioned talking windows. You might be silent for hours, but when it was time to thank St. Benedict for the turnips, you did it aloud and then promptly hushed. All of this left an echo that still whispers across our modern dinners. The phrase, "don't talk with your mouth full," didn't first drip from the lips of a Victorian governess or post-war etiquette coach. No, it simmered rather slowly over centuries of meals, centuries when words were weighted and silence was seasoned with reverence. And there's something just a little magical about that, isn't there? That when you sip your tea or stir your pasta quietly, you're unknowingly partaking in 1,000 years of table code. You, sleeper and supper lover alike, are a link in a long chain of silent chewers. Just as monks once gestured for butter with a raise of the eyebrow, and lords once signalled for salt with a subtle flick of the knuckle, we too carry messages with our mealtime stillness. Patience, presence, and maybe, just maybe, a healthy fear of sending couscous flying across the room. So next time you pause before speaking at dinner, know that your hush, however accidental, is echoing through medieval halls gilded with flickering light, past platters of capon and jars of quince paste, into the very hush of the holy cells. And with that gentle thought rolling slowly across the tongue, we prepare for one final moment in this magnificent, mysterious feast of memory. As the candle of our medieval meal burns down to its smouldering wick, let's take one last velvety bite into the tangled etiquette of yesteryear's dinner table. A world where napkins were optional, elbows were scandalous, and wasting salt was practically a federal offence. Imagine you've spent the day mucking about in a medieval village, dodging rain, rats, and questionable soup vendors. At last, you're invited to supper at the local manor. You straighten your tunic, take a deep breath of something that smells vaguely of roasted turnip, and step into a hall aglow with torchlight and the faint hope of something edible. Now, before you so much as look at a trencher, those thick slabs of stale bread doubling as medieval plates, you must first clasp your hands and say grace. This wasn't just religious formality. It was insurance. Word had it blessings might cancel out whatever had crawled across your meat while it roasted. And while we don't always murmur a prayer before devouring our toaster waffles today, the idea of acknowledging the food, and by extension, the effort behind it, has hardly vanished. We've just rebranded it with hashtags and artisanal lighting. Then comes the serving. In polite society, one did not load their plate with reckless abandon. No, that was what peasants and Vikings did. Instead, if you were high enough on the feudal food chain, food was presented to you. Lavish dishes strategically placed as social statements, not culinary delights. Peacocks in their own feathers, sugar sculptures taller than the hostess. The dish said, "I'm powerful." The guest said, "How lovely," and then nibbled a polite corner and secretly reached for the cheese. And here's the kicker. Many of those dishes were for display only. You see, medieval dining wasn't just about nourishment. It was mild theatre. One manuscript from the 15th century describes a roasted pig that, once carved, was found to be stuffed with live birds. A charming concept, unless you were hoping for an actual dinner and not a poultry explosion. But possibly the most enduring relic of medieval food rules is the unspoken etiquette of not talking with your mouth full. Even then, with no orthodontia and minimal access to anything resembling a toothbrush, it was considered unspeakably rude to speak while chewing. The rules encourage the slow, deliberate chewing of one's bite, a rhythm far better for digestion and bedtime storytelling. You were meant to eat with 3 fingers, the medieval equivalent of fine dining cutlery. Using all 5 fingers was, believe it or not, seen as vulgar, unless you were a knight eating ribs. In that case, you were allowed a 5th finger, but only if you promised to be heroic later. There were table manners for absolutely everything. Belching, slurping, biting hunks straight from the loaf, all signaled your questionable upbringing. And if you dared to lick your knife clean, may the saints have mercy. That blade had just sliced communal cheese. It wasn't yours to fondle with your tongue. Thank you very much. Smoking at the table? Unheard of in medieval Europe. The tobacco hadn't even arrived yet. But if it had, you'd still be banished for making the peacock smell weird. And what about leftovers, that humble bounty we now enshrine in Tupperware and abandon in the back of the fridge? In a noble household, untouched leftovers were often gifted to servants and the poor. It was structured charity sealed with crumbs of privilege. Curiously, we still do something similar today. We give away corporate event sandwiches to interns or post-party cake to the babysitter. Perhaps a remnant of that hierarchy unless, of course, she's also on TikTok. And when dessert finally graced the table, candied almonds, perfumed jellies, and occasionally fruit preserved in enough sugar to defeat a dragon, it offered more than sweetness. It was the finale of a well-rehearsed act, a polite cue. The evening winds down, the lute player yawns, the noble guest nod, stuffed with honor and goose, which brings us neatly, softly, gently to now, to the way we hold our forks, clink our glasses, or pass the peas without impaling someone's hand. Small survivals of a vast, tangled, half-remembered code of medieval cuisine. These rituals, these echoes, linger not because they're necessary, but because they're comforting, familiar, civilized, in a way the Middle Ages only pretended to be. So as the dreamlight flickers low and the table clears in your mind, let the clatter of goblets fade. Let the snoring barons drift off in the upper hall. Let the plum tarts glisten under moonlight in some tiny, crumb-dusted fantasy kitchen you may visit again. And now, dear listener, full of history and imaginary pheasant, you may finally give yourself permission to close your eyes. Sleep well, sweet squire of supper, for the feast is done, and the dreams are warm.